Once you're accustomed to the different texture, the different sensation on the palate of these types of wines, the sense of energy and life is really addictive.
It isn't new, but it's definitely having a moment.
This is a Pinot that we're serving. It's a lo-fi, pretty structured Pinot from Mount Gambier.
Call it lo-fi, minimal intervention or natural wine. This is the type of drink being poured in many of Australia's coolest bars and restaurants. There's no agreed upon definition for what makes a natural wine, but these brightly hued, Instagram-ready bottles are usually made from organic or biodynamic vineyards, with no or very few additives throughout the winemaking process. Forget any definitions though. The expressions you're more likely to hear around these drinks are words like juicy, vibrant, funky, or fizzy. True believers will tell you these wines are alive.
There's a sense of life that for me is irreplaceable. For me is one of the greatest enjoyments of wines like this, is that sense of nerve and energy and state of being alive that makes the wine so digestible and so delicious.
Campbell Burton is a wine importer and former sommelier at one of Melbourne's top restaurants. He recently opened a store dedicated to selling no additive wine.
Once you're accustomed to the different texture, the different sensation on the palate of these types of wines, in my opinion anyway, it's really difficult to go back. Like the sense of energy and life is really addictive.
It isn't uncommon for bottles of natural wine to sell for between $30 to $60 a bottle. That hasn't stopped demand growing and prompting more stores like Campbell Burton's to open. While there's no hard data on who's responsible for driving natural wine sales, a lot of the people who enter this store in Melbourne's Fitzroy North tend to skew younger. It might represent just a few drops of the 600 million litres of wine Australians consume each year, but supporters of this minimal approach to winemaking believe it's having an outsized influence in reshaping Australia's wine culture.
The traditional avenue for young people to embrace the wine industry, I don't even know how that used to happen. But now all of a sudden you've got wine drinkers who are 18 to 28 years old, whereas traditionally that demographic would have taken another 10 years to begin to enjoy wine. So the wine world at large really needs to thank people like that.
Jasper Button's picturesque vineyard in South Australia's Basket Range feels a long way from an inner-city wine store. His commune of Buttons Winery is coming to the end of a busy harvest. Barrels are being filled, grapes are being pressed, and the last of the Nebbiolo grapes are about to come off the vines. Things could hardly be going better.
It's a really exciting time to be a part of Australian winemaking at the moment. It's very new. It's very much expanding quickly. The number of new producers, even in this little region, are every year there seems to be another handful of people making wine. I think that's very exciting.
The Basket Range and Adelaide Hills region has become synonymous with Australia's wine counterculture. It's peppered with producers like Jasper, who see a minimalist approach to winemaking as being the best and purest expression of the grapes themselves. Critics of natural wine say it's just a bunch of idealistic hobbyists with dubious environmental credentials who make inconsistent wines for trend-chasing, virtue-seeking millennials.
People are looking for new and interesting things to drink. To a degree, winemaking in general has moved too far to an exercise in making a sound wine, and to a degree has forgotten about like the true and inherent deliciousness of what wine is or what wine can be.
In contrast to most modern wineries, Jasper Button's organic vineyards use no irrigation, and his wines have no additives, fining or filtration, save for a tiny bit of sulphur occasionally added at the end of the winemaking process.
So, Jasper, what exactly is going on in here?
There's basically just whole bunches of grapes fermenting in natural yeast. If we compare this to a more conventional approach where acid correction would have been made, sulphur added, and then yeast pitched for fermentation.
So have you actually added anything in here?
No, in here is only grapes.
Just grapes?
Just grapes.
Commune of Buttons wine has appeared on the lists of some top restaurants, including at the Sydney incarnation of Denmark's Noma, 4 times awarded the best restaurant in the world. While Jasper Button concedes that producers like him make up only a small part of Australia's wine industry, he thinks the new movement of winemakers around him are subverting and disrupting ingrained ideas about how wine should be made and sold.
In the current climate, with the difficulty of exports, particularly to China, obviously, looking at domestic sales and domestic consumption's an important thing. And for us, yes, we're small, but we're able to communicate, and we have an audience, and that audience is growing, and people are becoming more interested in drinking these kinds of wines, which is a really good thing.
A pretty easy and common way to dismiss this sort of wine is to say, well, there's just not that much of it made, that it only represents a tiny fraction of the total wine produced in Australia. But wine from this vineyard and others like it is not just turning up in a couple of cool bars and restaurants in Australian cities. It's turning up all over the world. So how's it going over there?
I would say generally the energy is good and the vibe is good, but it's very cautious still.
Washington State native Tess Bryant imports almost exclusively Australian natural wine and distributes it across 17 US states. It's not the easiest or cheapest thing in the world to do, but the demand makes it all worth it.
So far, from each of the producers I work with, I have bought everything that they will offer me.
That's equated to just shy of 50,000 bottles a year of Australian natural wine from producers like Jasper Button and a dozen or so others. The 34-year-old's business only started a few years ago after being blown away by a visit to Australia.
I know the first time I visited Australia was in 2017, and I'm from Northern California, which is generally considered to be progressive, like in a lot of ways. But when I landed in Australia, it was like, oh, no. Like, I felt like we were so far behind what was going on with a lot of the restaurants and the wine scene in Australia.
Tess Bryant's Australian wines aren't just sold into big states like California and New York. They're also distributed to stores in places like Montana, Wyoming and Idaho. She says the new wave of Australian counterculture wines is helping to change what she believes are some long-held and unfavourable perceptions.
The word Australian in front of wine for a long time had like a social stigma to it because of the background of all this commercial, like piss poor wine that came out of your country. Believe me, we make plenty of it. So it's, but it's been really exciting to see that change in a pretty phenomenal way, like pretty quickly.
New York Times chief wine critic Eric Asimov has been writing about wine for more than 2 decades. He says until recently, many Americans would probably only know Australian wine by one name, Critter wine.
For us, Critter wines are mass-produced, processed wines that are inexpensive and sell themselves by having a picture of a cute marsupial on the label.
When the New York Times sent Eric Asimov to Australia to cover what's happening with the wine culture here prior to the pandemic, it was the minimal intervention producers in places like the Adelaide Hills, Great Southern and Margaret River region who he found himself most drawn towards.
I was so impressed by the quality of the winemaking, how much they care, the very low tolerance for faults. And they were not wealthy trust fund kids who were having a lark. They were very serious and very good at what they did.
Opinions vary among judges at any wine competition.
8 years ago, Landline reported on the natural wine scene that was still in its infancy.
The converts to the arch-high priests of natural wine really love these things that are hissing and breaking wind and look murky in the glass and taste murky in the mouth. And the murkier they are, the better they are. And you do see some really, really strange things and ridiculous prices.
One of the producers Landline spoke to was the ringleader of the new movement, Anton van Klopper from Lucy Margot Wines.
I've learned that I could never spray and never have disease, which is You know, it might look ugly, but that's pretty amazing.
He and a handful of other Adelaide Hills producers now have a shared cellar door in Summertown, a few minutes away from his vineyard.
So 8 years ago, this wasn't a thing, was it?
No, we felt we needed a home for natural wines. Come and taste.
Cheers. Well, full disclosure, I really like this style of winemaking. But do you ever get people, you know, coming from a cellar door in the Barossa, walking in, trying this, and just being like, nah, this is not wine, I hate it, this is juice?
Well, Adelaideans are pretty polite, so you can sort of see it in their face. And we do have some wines that are less wild, which we generally steer them and make them happy. But for those that love natural wine, it's a true haven to come to.
Before he was called the godfather of Australian natural wine, Anton van Klopper was a top winemaking student at Adelaide University. After he grew frustrated at what he saw as the limiting conventions of modern winemaking, Van Klopper and a small group of other like-minded idealists set about making wine a different way.
I think the first natural wine tasting was done by Gio at 10 William Street. I think it was in 2010. And one person turned up. They did their first no sulphur wine tasting. And now the room would be undoubtedly full.
The enthusiasm for these sort of wines and the price point they're able to attract hasn't gone unnoticed. Liquor supermarket chain Dan Murphy's is now working with a growing group of producers to stock what it calls lo-fi wines in about 1/5 of its stores.
I guess when anything looks successful, people sort of jump on it. But it's, I don't know, I wouldn't call that natural wine. That it's just someone imitating. And hopefully people can taste the difference.
This is the last fruit to come off the vine, and we'll be picking it towards the end of next week.
As the wine counterculture scene becomes more mainstream, Jasper Button thinks producers should be wary of the temptation to scale up too far.
We have to be very careful not to grow in size so much that we lose the original idea.
Anton van Klopper has been making wine this way for over 10 years, and he shows no signs of changing.
And I think that with natural wine, to me, it's like looking at a landscape because it's unadulterated and you see the work from the producer and the work from the vineyard directly without any change. Whether you like the picture or not is up to you. But it's quite easy these days to manipulate it so you would find it attractive. But I find the beauty in the unmanipulated work.